Well, after a month with a break for Advent and the New Year, we return to our sermon series from the book of Daniel, Hope in a Hostile World. And this morning, we're in the lion's den. But before we get there, we've got some politics to navigate. Watching those disturbing news feeds from the US this past week, it's true what they say. All political careers end in failure. Though few fail quite so spectacularly as the outgoing president of the United States by inciting the mob to march on Capitol Hill and undermine democracy in the process. Yet in contrast, when you begin chapter 6 of Daniel, you meet a politician who finishes well. And the other thing you pick up from the opening verses, by way of a kind of refreshing change, is that there is such a thing as an upright politician. In fact, it was Daniel's personal integrity and commitment to a higher law, which is the reason that he eventually ends up in the lion's den. For our narrative this morning is not really about lions, but about laws. About the danger when government steps in to assume the role of God. We have, on the one hand, the law of the state, referred to in the passage as the laws of the Medes and Persians. And on the other, we have the divine law, which Daniel's enemies know he lives by. And those two things, those two laws, come into conflict and provide the backdrop against which the drama is worked out. And that drama, I say again, is not how to tame a lion, but how to put God first. Now, all of this raises a fundamental question for those with Christian faith. Are we willing to pay the cost of following Jesus? For there may come a time when we have to break the law of the land because it requires an obedience which we cannot give. Let's begin then with the impact of a consistent life. As our chapter opens, Daniel is about 80 years of age. Clearly, he doesn't believe in retirement. For 60 years, he served 3 kings as a brilliant public servant. Now, if you're familiar with Yes, Prime Minister, then Daniel is the Sir Humphrey of his day. And now, in the twilight of his career, he's the king's most trusted official and about to be appointed chief of staff. But Daniel's success, his Hebrew roots, and his obvious faith become the triggers for the professional jealousy and anti-Semitism of his civil service colleagues. Before we see how they plot his downfall and misrepresent his character, reflect on what a massive encouragement Daniel's example would have been to the Jews in Babylonian exile. There they were, part of a minority community in a culture that was hostile to their faith. And yet here was Daniel operating to great effect in the corridors of power. It is possible, you see, to have faith in God and be thoroughly involved in a society which doesn't share your spiritual values. Daniel tells us that you can rise to a position of significance and not compromise your convictions. In fact, those convictions can transform for the better the environment in which we live and work. Now, Jesus calls this being salt and light. We don't have to apologize for being talented and a Christian. You can be an influential leader in your company, a respected figure in your department, a gifted business person, a high flyer, and at the same time, be a committed believer. Hey, I'm not a great fan of that phrase, he or she is a full-time Christian worker. As if every other vocation is there for what? For part-time Christians? Is it second best if you're a Christian healthcare professional, a teacher, a stay-at-home mum? That is an unbiblical and dangerous concept. You don't need to be a missionary or a minister to serve God fully. Be a medic, but be the best Christian medic you can be. Be an engineer, but be the best Christian engineer you can be. Be an office worker, but be the best Christian office worker you can be. Don't misunderstand me when I say this. The church doesn't need more pastors. It needs more dedicated parents who love Jesus and their kids. It needs more reliable employees whose bosses promote them. It needs more Christians loving their neighbors. My friends, every calling matters. Each of us can live with impact if our lives are consistent. Mind you, live like a Daniel and you'll attract enemies as well as friends. People who don't like what you stand for and who will go to any lengths to undermine you. Which is what happens here. Daniel's opponents know that he has only one weak spot. They say in the text, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. Oh, that was the only thing that people had on us. Our commitment to faith, our love for God and his truth. You do wonder sometimes, don't you, that if a Christian was arrested for their faith, whether there'd be enough evidence to convict them. Anyway, Daniel's enemies know that they will have enough evidence, so long as they can create a crisis of conscience for him, which is what they do through the trap of a foolish law. Listen to verse 6 of our passage. So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "O King Darius, live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed," and by the way, that's a misleading lie. They hadn't all agreed, but they've all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so it cannot be altered in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians. Now, you can see, can't you, why that edict would have appealed to Darius. In this 30-day lockdown, he becomes divine. Nothing gets to heaven but doesn't go through him. Such a Darius appreciation month would not only have flattered his ego, it would provide a social cohesion for his vast multicultural empire. Okay, maybe it involved a minor infringement of personal liberty, but that was temporary. After all, governments are there to make certain laws. So the trap was set, and Daniel walks right into it. Listen to verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. I love that. Just as he had done before. He did what he'd always done. There's consistency for you. Daniel's private prayer life, like his professional public life, had the same quality of integrity. He didn't change his routine. He could have done. He could have argued, well, it's only for 30 days after all. I'll give it a miss for 30 days. Or maybe I could open the windows of the back bedroom and face Jerusalem still. No. He reasons that for him, prayer to Jehovah, the God of Israel, and not Darius, was a first commandment issue. You shall have no other gods before me, even when it's only for a month. So he had a decision to make. Was he going to put his life on the line and pray, or deny his faith and stay silent? Was he going to bow down to the idol of safety, or risk his life? What mattered most? And he calls it, in a world where you cannot eliminate all risk, Daniel deemed the greater risk was not to pray. For prayer is the way that this man reinforces who he is and for whom he lives. Now, his civil disobedience wasn't loud and brash, but it was deliberate. He and his faith were not going to become invisible. He was going to put God first. For governments should not attempt to be God. And his praying made that point. A change of law was going to make no difference to his spiritual habits. Perhaps the greatest moment of danger in this whole episode was not when the state threw open the doors of the lion cage, but when the state insisted that Daniel should close the windows of his prayer room. But Daniel reasoned, why change the habit of a lifetime? Crisis? What crisis? In fact, as we know, structure and repetition is often what helps people survive, as we're trying to do right now in our COVID crisis. The brilliance of the concert pianist is the result of what? Of hours and hours of practice. My friends, discipline is one of the keys to your success. The effectiveness of a Christian life is to pray not just when you feel like it, but when you don't feel like it. The prayer habit of Daniel set him free to be faithful to his God. Can I say this? Never despise spiritual routines. They may well be what saves you one day. And says the text, he got down on his knees to pray. Now, I don't think there is necessarily anything special about Daniel's prayer posture there. God hears real prayer, whether we're standing or sitting down, whether we're reciting from a prayer book or whatever. But I do think it can be a significant posture. Getting on your knees says something. It speaks of humility before God. That movement down can helpfully remind me of who I am and who he is. So if you can, give your knees a spiritual workout from time to time. Certainly the direction of Daniel's praying towards Jerusalem is, I think, significant. If you were a Jew in exile, this was one of the ways that you maintained your distinctiveness and identity. To pray for the peace of Jerusalem was to be aligned with the great purposes of God. For it wasn't the city of Babylon, but the city of God that was the great hope for humanity. So Daniel here wasn't engaging in some sentimental attachment to a pile of stones. No, Zion was the place to which God would one day send his king who would save the world. So he got down on his knees. And as he did so, he would have been thinking, they may have destroyed the temple. They may have enforced on us this national lockdown in Babylon. They may have stopped access to the central traditions of our religious life. But they cannot and they will not stop us worshiping and praying. Does all that sound a little bit familiar? Of course it does. That is not a million miles away from some of our emotions because of COVID-19. They can stop us from gathering together in worship, but they cannot stop us worshiping and praying. But the foolish law wasn't only a trap for Daniel, it was just as much a trap for Darius, the king. He realizes this when the informants tell him, "Oh, king, you know that Jewish refugee, you know your favorite. Well, he pays no attention to you. And you know that law you enacted, which cannot be repealed, by the way? Well, Daniel keeps breaking it. And all day, the king tries frantically to find a legal loophole. But in the end, he has to give the order. Seal the entrance to the den with a stone. In other words, feed him to the lions. But while the king can't sleep all night, amazingly, Daniel does. And get this, so do the lions. Well, if they're not actually sleeping, they must certainly have been fasting. And that sets up our final section, the rescue of a faithful God. At dawn, the king runs to the mouth of the lion pit, fearing the worst. Verse 20. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to rescue you from the lions?" And much to his surprise but relief, Daniel responds. And this is the only time we hear Daniel speak in the entire chapter. And even then, we don't get much from him about what happened that night in the lion's den. Simply this: Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions." That's it. No more detail about the lions, just the simplest but most profound explanation. My God shuts the mouths of lions. That's all anyone needs to know How God did it is not important, but that God did it is obvious. The rescue of a faithful God, the God who shuts the mouths of lions. Of course he does, but not always. And that's what the writer to the Hebrews acknowledges in that famous chapter 11 as he describes the heroes of faith in that hall of fame. He lists them. And then he says, I don't have time to tell about Gideon, Samson, David, who through faith conquered kingdoms, and here comes Daniel, who shut the mouths of lions, who quenched the fury of the flames, who routed foreign armies. But then he goes on to say this, listen up. Others were tortured. Some faced flogging. Still others were chained. They were stoned, sawed in two, and were put to death by the sword. So what are we learning here? Surely this. The lesson of Daniel and the lion's den is not that God will always change our circumstances, but that he will always be with us in them. For the Bible never promises that when the people of God risk their lives for him, the outcome will always be a happy one. Daniel was prepared to pay the cost of obedience to God, whatever. And that is the challenge to us of this passage. If necessary, is loving God worth going to prison for? That's what should make Christians different and the state tremble. Christianity is not for wimps, but warriors who have one primary loyalty. So you know as well as I do that there are Christians living in certain cultures today who, in order to be obedient to God, must be disobedient to the state. For Jesus is their Lord, not Caesar. Their conscience is captive only to him. So that if Christians have to obey God rather than men, then it should not be because the government is being liberal in some way, or because the sovereignty of the people is being undermined, but because the name of God is at stake. That's why we disobey. And living like that means that Christians have to spell faith R-I-S-K, risk. But to live like that means that we believe God will always in the end vindicate his name and those who are truly his. Which is what we pick up from the king's final proclamation there in verse 27. King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land, I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. So here comes another law of the Medes and Persians. Ironically, of course, it reverses the earlier one. And that's meant to make us smile, because such laws are beginning now to look a little bit silly. For now we have a new statute on the statute books, which doesn't forbid prayer to Daniel's God, but actually commands it. Says the king in his edict, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. That's our sovereign God who delivers and rescues. There is no law or throne higher than his. And every man, woman, and child, every government is finally accountable to him. His kingdom is the only one that lasts forever. No wonder that the early Christian church saw in Jesus' life a rerun of Daniel's. For Jesus too was faithful to God and paid the price of that obedience. He also prayed while facing the greatest crisis of his life. He too was plotted against and condemned by the state, though innocent, to die. His body was placed in a pit, and a stone sealed the entrance to it. But like Daniel, God rescued him from the lions of death. More than that, God raised him and vindicated him and gave him a name that is above every other name. And one day, at that name, the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue confess. And those of us who have already taken the knee to Jesus and love him, pick up our cross to follow him, whatever the cost, knowing that in this world we will have trouble. We will face unjust accusation. People will plot against us and misrepresent us. But do not fear, says Jesus to those who take the knee to him. Do not fear, I have overcome the world. So, like our Savior, we will live and die proclaiming a higher law, looking for a coming kingdom that is not of this world, knowing that the same power that raised Jesus to life lives in us today, and believing that one day he will rescue us from death and bring us into God's new creation kingdom. In one way, all of this is simple but profound. So here's the question. Do you believe that? Are you prepared to die for that vision of the future? I realized as I was preparing this message, I realized how the plot line of Daniel chapter 6 is really an exposition of last Sunday's motto text for 2021. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer.